That is a absolutely atrocious introduction to my story because it makes Richard Gere sound like the last gasp stop.
At 57, Julia Roberts has nothing left to prove. She's conquered Hollywood, earned global admiration, and guarded her private life fiercely. But now, for the first time, she's peeling back the curtain, revealing a truth about her connection with Richard Gere that left even longtime fans stunned. It wasn't just a Hollywood pairing. It was something deeper, more complicated, and more real than anyone ever imagined. What she just confessed will make you gasp. When Pretty Woman hit theaters in 1990, it wasn't just a box office phenomenon. It was a cultural reset. Audiences fell in love with the story of a wealthy businessman and a spirited escort. But what truly electrified the screen was the undeniable chemistry between Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. From the very first frame, their connection wasn't just acting, it was something magnetic. And behind the scenes, everyone felt it. The director Gary Marshall once admitted that if he hadn't cast those two, Pretty Woman would have never worked. But what he didn't say publicly, at least not then, was just how close it came to falling apart before it even began. Julia Roberts was just 21 years old during filming. Bright-eyed, inexperienced, and relatively unknown. Richard Gere, at 40, was already a Hollywood veteran. On paper, they were miles apart. But when the two finally sat down together for a chemistry read, something happened in the room that no one could explain. Gary Marshall later revealed that he was about to lose Julia for the role. She was nervous, unsure if she was right for it, and Richard had already turned it down once. But during the reading, Julia nervously passed Richard a note that said, "Please say yes." He smiled, turned to the director, and simply said, "Okay, I'm in." That moment was more than a casting decision. It was the beginning of a deep emotional bond that would shape both of their lives. From that day on, Julia and Richard shared a closeness that went far beyond typical co-stars. On set, their banter was effortless, their intimacy real, and their body language spoke volumes. Even when the cameras weren't rolling, they would sit together, talk quietly in corners, and laugh like old friends. It wasn't romantic in the conventional sense, but it was charged with something deeper, a mutual trust and emotional safety that neither of them had expected. Julia would later say, "Richard was my protector. He made me feel safe in a world I didn't understand." The film had several tense moments during production. Julia, still learning how to navigate stardom, would sometimes become overwhelmed. There's one now famous story about her having a full-blown anxiety attack on set. She was shaking, panicked, on the verge of walking off. It was Richard who stepped in. Without saying a word, he took her hand, looked into her eyes, and just breathed with her until she calmed down. Everyone on set went silent. That moment became symbolic, not of romance, but of a bond that was unshakable. And it didn't end with Pretty Woman. Though they didn't work together again for nearly a decade, their friendship never faded. They'd check in, send notes, and quietly support one another through life's ups and downs, divorces, losses, successes. When they finally reunited in 1999 for Runaway Bride, the magic was still there. The crew reported the same kind of emotional closeness, the same effortless chemistry, and the same quiet understanding between two people who didn't need words to feel connected. But even with decades of friendship behind them, Julia Roberts never publicly said just how much Richard Gere meant to her, until now. For over 3 decades, Julia Roberts carefully guarded the truth about her relationship with Richard Gere. The media always speculated. Were they in love? Were they ever together off-screen? But Julia kept quiet. In every interview, she offered smiles and vague praise. She'd call Richard wonderful, gracious, a gentleman, but she never dug deeper. Not until recently. Now at 57, Julia has finally opened the emotional vault. And what she revealed about Richard shocked even her closest friends. The reason she stayed silent for so long wasn't scandal or secrecy. It was protection. Julia once admitted in a rare behind-the-scenes interview that what she and Richard shared was so special, so emotionally intimate, that putting it into words would only cheapen it. She didn't want the tabloids to twist it, didn't want the world to reduce their bond to rumors. For Julia, Richard wasn't just a co-star. He was a constant, someone who saw her for who she was before the world even knew her name. But the silence came with a price. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, Julia battled loneliness, despite her fame. Failed relationships, intense media scrutiny, and the pressure of being America's sweetheart weighed heavily on her. And yet, even during those darkest times, there was one person who always reached out, quietly, without fanfare. Richard Gere. Julia revealed in a recent podcast that during one of the most difficult moments of her life, shortly after a painful breakup, Richard sent her a handwritten letter. No cameras, no headlines, just ink and honesty. In the letter, he wrote, "You are stronger than you know and softer than anyone realizes. That's your power. Don't lose it." She kept that letter for 20 years. The emotional impact of that moment stayed with her. She said she cried for hours after reading it, not because it was romantic, but because it was real. Richard had seen through the Hollywood armor. He reminded her of who she was before the world turned her into a brand. It was something no one else in her life had done so consistently. Over the years, they had other quiet exchanges, phone calls on birthdays, flowers during difficult film shoots, a short handwritten note tucked into a bouquet on the 25th anniversary of Pretty Woman that simply said, "Thank you for trusting me." Julia never shared these details with the press, not until now. Why now? Julia says it's because, at 57, she finally feels brave enough to honor the people who shaped her without fear of misinterpretation. "I owe so much of who I am, not just as an actress, but as a woman, to Richard," she said. "There's a calmness, a depth in him. He anchored me in ways I didn't understand back then." And the emotion in her voice wasn't just nostalgia. It was something unresolved. Something that maybe, for years, she couldn't even admit to herself. Their relationship was never about romance, not in the traditional sense. It was something more nuanced, more spiritual. They were kindred spirits who understood each other in a way few ever could. And Julia hid that truth not out of shame, but because she feared the world wouldn't understand it. Now, finally, she's ready to let it be known. Some people enter your life for a season. Richard was a lifetime. It was supposed to be just another reunion, a chance for two beloved co-stars to rekindle the magic for a new generation. But what happened during the filming of Runaway Bride in 1998 would shake Julia Roberts to her core and leave her forever changed in the way she saw Richard Gere. Behind the camera, something profound unfolded. And it was this single moment, never captured by the press, that Julia would later call the most emotional experience I've ever had on a film set. The chemistry was still there. That was obvious from the first scene. The spark hadn't faded. The laughter was natural. But on the third week of filming, a deeply personal scene brought Julia to a breaking point. The script called for her character, Maggie, to confront the fear of commitment, to admit she had spent her life running from real love. As the cameras rolled and the director called action, Julia froze. The words wouldn't come. Her eyes filled with tears, not for the scene, but for something buried much deeper. The set fell silent. Crew members looked to the director, unsure what to do. But it wasn't the director who stepped forward. It was Richard. Slowly, gently, he walked over to Julia, took her hands in his, and leaned in. No one heard what he whispered, but whatever it was, it broke her. She collapsed into him, crying silently, her head resting against his chest. The cameras weren't rolling. This wasn't part of the performance. This was real. That moment lasted barely a minute, but the emotion in it lingered for days. Richard didn't speak about it then, and neither did Julia. But years later, she would reveal in an interview that what he whispered to her was this: "You don't have to run anymore. Not from this. Not from yourself." Those words, Julia said, hit her like a lightning bolt. Because Richard wasn't just talking to her character. He was talking to the real Julia, the woman who had spent years hiding behind roles, behind public smiles, behind the carefully curated image of America's sweetheart. In that moment, he saw her pain and met it with nothing but love. Julia later admitted that she almost walked away from acting during that time. Fame had taken its toll. Trust was hard to come by, but that moment with Richard reminded her why she started, all the way back on the set of Pretty Woman, when she was a scared 21-year-old looking for someone to believe in her. and Richard did. Every step of the way. Now at 57, Julia Roberts stands at a reflective crossroads. Decades of fame behind her, a rich life filled with family, motherhood, and career highs. And yet, when asked recently about the men who shaped her journey, it wasn't a husband, a director, or a former flame she named first. It was Richard Gere. Her voice didn't waver. Her eyes softened, and she said simply, "He's always been the one person I could never explain to anyone else." For years, fans speculated. Were they ever in love? Did they ever share more than just on-screen magic? Julia has now admitted that the answer isn't simple, because it wasn't romance as most people understand it. It was something more elusive, more spiritual. "We never had to say the words," she said. "We just always knew there was a thread between us, always connecting, always present, no matter how far apart our lives became." It wasn't about physical attraction. It was about recognition, seeing someone in a way that most people never allow themselves to. Julia confessed that even in her happiest moments, Richard's presence always lingered in the back of her mind, not as a what if, but as a what always was. She described him as her emotional mirror, someone who reflected her truest self, even when she didn't want to face it. In a recent awards event, where both were honored for their contributions to cinema, Julia took the stage and surprised the entire room with an unscripted tribute. Holding back tears, she looked out at Richard and said, "You taught me how to be brave, not just in front of a camera, but when the cameras weren't there. You saw me when I didn't see myself." The crowd applauded, but Richard just smiled, that quiet smile, the one only Julia seemed to understand. Their lives took different paths. Richard married, divorced, became a father. Julia found her own peace with a family of her own. They were never lovers, never entangled in a Hollywood scandal. And yet, the emotional intimacy they shared ran deeper than many marriages in the spotlight. It's the kind of connection that defies labels. And as Julia now says, not everything that matters needs to be named. Behind the curtain of Hollywood, where everything is scripted, performed, and carefully polished for public consumption, their relationship stood apart. It was real, and because it was real, they protected it. That's why they stayed quiet for so long, not out of shame, but reverence. In the twilight of their careers, with legacy and mortality becoming more present themes, Julia has begun to share more openly. Not to stir headlines, but to honor the truth. A truth that fans have felt for decades, but never heard in full. And now, they finally have. So what did she finally say that made everyone gasp? It wasn't some scandalous reveal. It was this. "Richard was the love story I never needed to live to know it was real. He's part of me. Always was. Always will be." And with that, the room fell silent. Because in that moment, Julia Roberts didn't just reveal something about her past. She revealed something timeless about love itself. That sometimes, the deepest connections don't need a romance, a kiss, or a headline. Sometimes they just need a look and a lifetime of understanding.